Ani, Jibai Indigenakaz, carry the same name as my father, which is a spirit, a departed spirit. And I'm Little Traverse Bay Band's Odawa, and I was born here in Waganakzing, and I grew up hearing a lot about the people and the things that we did, the things we learned, and all of the good things, all of the bad things. And I'm here to share with you today some of the memories passed down through my family. I'm descended from the Sinaways, from Middle Village, up the Wayne, it was called. Still is called that. It means the halfway place. It's where Goodhart now is, a little bit south of Goodhart along Lake Michigan. And most of my traditions and stories that I've learned were handed down to me through my father, who was raised by his great aunt. And she was in Sinaway, Elizabeth Sinaway. And she was born about 1850. And she was from the up the Waying settlement of Middle Village. And she taught him a lot. And he would always tell me these stories that he knew of. And so I'm passing them on to everyone so that other people will know too about these things that have happened in the past and how our people have lived and done things, to be able to perpetuate our culture by telling these stories over and over. One of the things that comes very clear when these stories are told is how strong of a connection that we had with the big lakes. Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, Lake Superior, all these other ones. My father's great aunt talked about how during her time, she was a young woman, that we traveled all over these lakes. We just didn't live in one spot and stay there and live out our lives there, but we traveled all over. So how during the course of a year, they would go from the Upper Peninsula, they would take their boats and they would go up across the straits to Whitefish Bay, Whitefish Point, up there in around the Tequamanon River area. And they would pick berries. And when they would get their berries picked, then they would go and they would look for this stuff that's called in English red ochre. On the south side of where the Tequamanon River flows into Whitefish Bay, if you dig back in the dunes back there, you come across this red-colored soil. It's called onanum in Anishinaabe in our language. And it's used in ceremonies. It's used for writing out messages during ceremonies within a padded down area. You've seen some of the things that the Navajos have done with making of these sand paintings. Well, this is similar to that, but it's for different reasons. It's for ceremonies, for good luck, and for being able to teach different types of things to younger people. Okay? Onanum, it's also put into graves sometimes. And so we would gather up, large quantities, bags of it, and we would bring it back for the year's use. But then the people would travel further south, down back into, the northern part of Lake Michigan, and they would continue picking berries all along the west shore over on the Wisconsin side. They go down through Green Bay and down through Milwaukee and down through there. And they go all the way to Chicago with these berries. And they would set up their baskets of berries at the docks in Chicago. And they would sell their berries to people in town there in Chicago and merchants who would come around and they'd want to be able to, purchase the berries. And then some of the people would spend the winter down there. We have traditions in our family that some of our ancestors, there was one whose name was Jean-Baptiste Sinaway, he was born on the Kankakee River because they would spend the winters down there. That's south of Chicago, down there into Kankakee River flows through northern Illinois and then Indiana down into that particular region. And then in the spring, they would come back and they would visit along with the Potawatomi people, the Potawatomis, that is, that, as they come back up the east side of the state and then come back here and, rejoin the rest of the people who did stay here year-round, okay? So we would sail through all these different areas of the Great Lakes, collecting these different types of things. A place in over near Escanaba is where she talked about they would go and they would get birch bark because that was the best quality of bark that was used for heavy construction of canoes. That there wasn't any real high quality birch bark in this particular area to be used for the making of canoes. And so they would go there specifically to gather, the high quality, birch for that particular purpose. The fishing traditions associated with the water are really, really marvelous stories. We had such a strong connection. Our knowledge of the water and the forest was so intimate that we could survive and know exactly what to do at different types of situations. For example, when she would talk about the Sturgeon Bay up here north of Cross Village. Okay, it's called Sturgeon Bay because of the fact that there were a lot of sturgeon in that particular area, and men would go out there every winter and fish. I don't know anyone left alive who still remembers their families talking about this, but there were people who know, like my father's grandfather. He was one of the men from Middle Village that would go with the men from Cross Village out to Sturgeon Bay, and they had these spuds. They had small wood carts, like sleds, that they pulled out there. And they had cut a lot of pine boughs beforehand to go out there to go fishing, because the method that they used to fish was that they would, spud a hole, and then they would put down these pine boughs so they don't have to lay their bodies right onto the ice, that they have these pine boughs to lay on, and it has an air insulation to be able to keep them warmer. And they would have a blanket or some type of covering that they would put over their heads, and they could lay right down and put their face right into that hole, and they could see down there, and with that darkened over top of them, they could see better down in there. And the tribe does have, they hopefully still have, one of the spears that were used by these men that was from Indiantown in Harbor Springs. It was found in one of the houses. And when we passed it around, well, people says, yeah, that's what, one of those old time ones. They had really long handles on them. They were about 8 foot long. And that's the kind of spears that these men were using at the time when they were hovered down over there, because the water there is very deep. It's quite shallow compared by the depth of the whole lake, but it's like 8 to 10 foot deep. And they would jig these hand-carved wood decoys. They were shaped like herring. They would carve them to make them look like a herring, because that was one of the foods that the sturgeon would be eating. And they would dangle that herring, and they would wait for one to come there, and they would be able to spear them. They took their dogs with them, and they stayed right out there, and they made these lean-tos, and they slept right out there until they filled these sleds they had up with fish. They were frozen fish, and they would feed the frozen fish to the dogs too. And they wouldn't go back home until they had made it worth their while. They stay out there sometimes for a week, on the ice and fishing like that. So then they could take all of these fish back to the settlement and hand them out to people, as they were done fishing for the year. So just that method of fishing alone, is something quite, spectacular. You don't see people fishing like that anymore. And I know that, I wish I could remember the names of, Dean Samuel's father used to talk about this too. Because I had talked to Dean about this, and he said, yeah, he says he remembers his dad, talking about that sort of a thing. that if any of you know who Dean Samuels, is. That's Terry Samuels' dad, tribal doctor. And there's tons of other stories about fishing. It's a very dangerous place, and one of the traditions that always impressed me was the fact that, they talk about that you only fish in small groups, like of about 2 or 3 men, at a time in the winter. Because my grandfather, he used to fish too in the winter off Goodhart there. He'd go out there in the wintertime, walk out there for several miles and spud a hole. He'd take, dogs and, these poles with him, and he'd spud these holes, and he would put up this series of poles in there and pour water in the holes, and it would freeze, and that way he'd be able to spread these tarps out as a windbreak, because it's terrible cold out there in the winter, you can imagine, And they'd say that he would come back and his skin was just all gnarled and, all just beat up from the wind, being out there. There's terrible, conditions. But he would set nets under the ice, and he'd spud holes and through a series of holes, and he would put the nets down through one and anchor it there, and then he'd go down the next hole, pull it from underneath the water down through there and set it, And my mother used to have to take him his food, his lunch, in the around the middle of the day, and he'd always tell her that always follow my tracks, don't ever go off my tracks, because it takes a lot of practice to be able to read that ice. That ice can be just a couple inches thick some places, but other places it could be several feet. But knowing how to look at it and read it, is a very important skill to be able to learn. And a lot of men were lost one time. That men used to go out in big groups and they would, fish. But what happened this one particular winter is that the wind shifted very quickly, and it pushed the ice out so that it separated from the other pieces of ice that were there, and nearly all of the men in the settlement died. And so after that, what they decided that they would do is that the men would not go out in large groups anymore, that they would go out in small groups, because it was a real hardship to lose most of the men in the settlement. And so they had to adapt very quickly to be able to survive, and accommodate for all of those men who had perished, as a result, freezing to death on the ice. And there still were stories too about people individually floating off on the ice and ending up in the UP, and then coming back down this way in the spring after things had frozen. They were able to come back by the ferry or some fisherman's boat or something like that down into this particular area. And so I'm just trying to impress on you some of the highlights of stories about fishing, and the level of intimacy that we have had in the past with our environment, the ability to survive. We weren't like a bunch of hippies, prancing through the woods and munching on berries, kind of thing. It was a very difficult life to live. Starvation was a very real and day-to-day type of situation. We like to romanticize about our ancestors and think that, things were all, nice and wonderful and stuff like that. But, life was hard, and they talked about those hard times. I was telling you about my father being raised by his great aunt, and they got all their water from Lake Michigan, because they were only several hundred feet from, Lake Michigan. So it was part of his job to go and get the water. And in the winter, one day he went down to the beach to go get the water again, and he saw somebody walking out way out there on the ice, And he watched the person and noticed that they were coming towards the shore. And so this was about late 1920s, somewhere in through there. And anyway, I shortened the story up. The fellow ended up coming over to the house where my father lived, and with his great aunt. And he looked, fearful. Not himself, but the way he looked. put fear in his grandmother, his great aunt and his, himself, that because he was covered with ice and he was you could tell that he was practically dead from being froze, I guess. And so they took him into the house, and they cut off. They had to take a knife and cut off his clothing, his shoes and stuff, because they were his skin and legs had become one with his clothing and his boots and things. And there was no plows in those days to be able to get down there, and so my father had to, hike up top of the bluffs to the Goodhart store there, and they did have a telephone, and was able to, call somebody for help. But anyway, this fellow was from Charlevoix. That he and about 4 or 5 other guys had gone out onto the ice and, fished off in Charlevoix. But this phenomenon I was telling you about, where the wind shifted and broke the ice away, shifted them all further north. The Coast Guard was alerted in Charlevoix as to what had happened, and they went in search of him with a boat on the open waters. But all of the Coast Guard guys froze to death. They themselves couldn't get, the boat to be able to move. They got frozen into the ice, and they weren't prepared to be out there, I guess, for a long period of time. And so, they all perished. And this fellow, who was part of the original group from Charlevoix that had gone out fishing, was the only one left. And he finally made it. He did survive, and if you ever want to read more about it, it occurred was written up in about 1960, something like that, in a magazine called Outdoor Life. And my father and his great aunt are mentioned in the article too, and how he was able to help save this fellow's life. And he lived until not all that long ago in Charlevoix, and was I think his last name was Brown, from Charlevoix, there. So, and there are many other stories. There's a story of Joe Kijgo-Benessi and I forget the name of the other fellow from Middle Village. And it was during the summertime, and it was a big storm that come through, and there was some folks who were stuck out there like that from fishing. And so Joe Kijgo-Benessi and this other fellow from Middle Village went out in a boat they had, but it was a lot smaller than the boat the fishermen had, and they went out there and they were able to get, these guys saved, from out there in the water. But anyway, that could go on and on. There's all kinds of mentions of things. But again, I stress the fact that, water, and how connected we were with water, in our past lives, and how we've gotten away from that. The water was always spoken of as like a highway, because that's how we used to get around. Today we're so dependent upon terrestrial, transportation, cars and all those kinds of things, that we don't think often about, how we used to get around, and life for us was a lot different. But our survival skills were pretty high. We knew how to survive and get through a lot of these different kinds of circumstances that, that have happened in the past. And I want to just jump real quick into one more, then I'll shut up. But there was some folks that come to do some teachings for us, Marie Ashkabuk and can't think of his, Willie Trudeau from Manitoulin Island in Ontario. And was visiting with them, and they had brought her mother with them. And she said she was up to the casino, and she was looking underneath, from a distance, one of the card tables, the gaming tables, that were going on. And she said she saw a little person, one of the little people, Bogwajnine. That's the ones that are way out, way wild away, living out, the Bogwajnine, the ones who live, the men who live, way out, remote, kind of area. And there's different kinds of those little people, but this is a specific type of them. And she saw one of those. He was underneath the table. And she says that as soon as he saw her and recognized that they could see him, well, he took off running, and disappeared under, and in the crowds of the thing there. Well, that was pretty special, because when I was a young teenager, the hair around on the temple of my head started to turn white, like gray. And I thought that was kind of unusual, that, being such a young man, that my hair would start to turn, white that early in my life. And so I asked my father about it, and he says, that happened to me when I was a young man. He says, my hair started to turn, white around my temples like that. And he says, what I was told, his great aunt told him, is that he has been touched by the little people. And when your hair starts to turn white around the temples like that at a very young age, it means that the little people see something special in you. And so they have marked you on the temples. They have come when you were a baby and they touched you. And that means that they will only show themselves to you if they're going to, communicate with people in any particular way. And so I never saw, any of the white, any of the Pukojin in my lifetime. But my father had told me that he had, after he had gotten to be an older teenager, that he had seen them, and that they would come around to the place where he lived, one place where he lived there in Middle Village, and they'd come through the walls. They wouldn't do harm or anything like that, but they would come, and what he was told is that they will give you messages. But he never was aware of any kind of a message, or didn't know how to read any of the messages that he was provided with, that they may have given him at that particular point. So, but there's stories of, the little people around all over, all down along Harbor Point and those areas. There's talk of, little people, being down there, living underneath at the point. There's some little holes, little caves like down in through there. I've never seen anything down there like that, but that's something. But it's part of, the association again with the water and, all that around the lake there in that particular area. I'd love to go on for a long time about, a lot more different things that have been told to me, but I think maybe this is enough for this particular session, and hopefully we can, do more of these kinds of things, in the future, so that people will learn and remember and be curious enough to ask around and even find out more if you're interested. Because I'm really glad that it's being recorded. So, Kuchimigwach.